It's great to be here, ladies and gentlemen. What a pleasure it is to have been invited. And of course, it's wonderful to be in the beautiful city of Bergen, one of the very few places in the world where the weather is even worse than London. It's great to be here. I'm afraid, being British, I will begin with an apology. Unlike our distinguished speakers, I'm not a professor of anything. And unlike Yanis, I've never been charged with saving the Greek economy from collapse, a task whose achievability I regard with some skepticism. But the one thing I can offer, perhaps, is that I have a very different perspective on things to most Westerners, despite being one. I am both an insider and an outsider. I was born in the Soviet Union and grew up there, and then early 1990s Russia, before moving to England as a teenager. And being Russian, I must also begin with a warning, I'm afraid. Many of you will be familiar with the story of the boiling frog, a frog that sits in water that gets increasingly warmer without noticing the frog is cooked. Well, those of us who come from Eastern Europe have been cooked before. And my warning is that it's getting really hot in here, I'm afraid. So, by the way, I loved Yanis's present, and Cynthia's too, of course, but Yanis's present, I mean, if he's arguing that the West is not in decline, I'm really terrified of what decline is going to look like by comparison. Now, the subject of tonight's debate is whether the West is in decline, but to answer it, I must address an obvious question, at least to me, that sits underneath this entire discussion, which is the fact that many people in our societies, including many intellectuals, journalists, and academics, would like our society to be in decline, because it validates the worldview that they have of the rich imperial white colonialists who must be finally stripped of their ill-gotten gains of the kind that we've just heard described on stage. And I say that this sits underneath our discussion because once a society has sufficiently imbibed this mind virus, it is inevitably going to question its own survival. If enough people believe that their society is bad, how could they not bring about its decline? Now, let me be clear, I don't think decline is inevitable. On the contrary, I think it's extremely avoidable. We just have to choose to avoid it. And my warning is not intended to provoke paralysis, it's intended to provoke action. Incidentally, before we go on, the question about whether the West is good and worth preserving has an easy, obvious, and uncontestable answer. That answer is Australia. Australia is a Western country in a non-Western part of the world, surrounded by non-Western countries. I was there earlier this year. And in Australia, there are precisely 0 people who get onto rickety boats every year to brave shark-infested waters in search of a better life elsewhere. 0 people. The traffic is all one way, in the opposite direction. The same is true on the southern border of the United States. The same is true in the Mediterranean. The same is true in the English Channel, where tens of thousands of people cross over from Calais into Britain illegally every year. And I'm not blaming the people. I wouldn't want to stay in France either. My point is, if you look at how people vote with their feet, Western civilization blows the competition out of the water. I know this is politically incorrect to say nowadays, but our civilization is better. I know you don't like to hear it, but it is. That's not just my opinion, that's the opinion of millions of people who come every year, and the hundreds of millions who would if they could. And that is despite the fact that we are undoubtedly going through a period of decline. Now, what do I mean by decline? I think we do owe an explanation and a definition, and each of us probably has our own. In 1978, my countryman Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who had just left the Soviet Union after many years in the gulags, came to the United States and gave an address to the Harvard students on their commencement address. And here's what he said. Let me quote him briefly. "A decline in courage may be the most striking feature which an outside observer notices in the West in our days. The Western world has lost its civil courage, both as a whole and separately, in each country, in each government, in each political party, and of course in the United Nations. Such a decline in courage is particularly noticeable among the ruling groups and the intellectual elite, causing an impression of loss of courage by the entire society. Of course, there are many courageous individuals, but they have no determining influence on public life. Political and intellectual bureaucrats showed depression, passivity, and perplexity in their actions and in their statements, and even more so in theoretical reflections to explain how realistic, reasonable, and intellectually, and even morally warranted it is to base state policies on weakness and cowardice. And decline in courage is ironically emphasized by occasional explosions of anger and inflexibility on the part of those same bureaucrats when dealing with weak governments and weak countries not supported by anyone, or with currents which cannot offer any resistance. But they get tongue-tied and paralyzed when they deal with powerful governments and threatening forces, with aggressors and international terrorists. Should one point out that from ancient times, decline in courage has been considered the beginning of the end? I'm sad to say that his message has aged excruciatingly well. Not only is it still true, it's more true today than it was 50 years ago. But forget Solzhenitsyn, how about we listen to our fellow citizens? In Britain, 68% of people, when polled in a recent Ipsos poll, said that Britain is in decline. Why do British people feel this way? Well, we're inherently miserable. That's part of it, but in case it's just not the only explanation, let's look at the facts. In Britain, GDP per capita fell very sharply in 2007 during the financial crisis, and has still not recovered. Put simply, on average, British people are poorer today than they were in 2007. And I'm afraid to say, this is true here in Norway too. It's true in Sweden, in Iceland, in Finland, in France, in Italy, Spain, Portugal, and in Ireland. I'm afraid it's true in Greece, where the GDP fell from $32,000 in 2008 to just $23,000 today. And this is not an accident. Because politicians are judged on whether they grow GDP, not GDP per capita, they don't actually care about whether we are getting richer or poorer. The easiest way to deliver GDP growth is to increase the number of bodies in the country, the number of people. That's the way you do it. And the way they've done it, by importing low-skill, low-wage people from other parts of the world, has made us poorer in a way that we can't blame them for it. Economic growth in Britain is not just anemic, it's fake. It's an accounting trick. As for Europe, it's been an economic decline for at least a decade. That's not me telling you that or Yanis telling you that. Those are the words of José Manuel Barroso, the former president of the European Commission, writing earlier this week. Now look, money isn't everything. It can't buy you happiness, although it can buy you cars with heated seats, which is the closest thing to happiness that I've discovered in Norway. But the absence of money does make misery a lot more probable. I'm going to talk about Britain for a moment, but wherever you've come from or wherever you're watching this on the internet, see if this rings a bell. We release dangerous criminals from prison because of overcrowding. The police do not investigate crimes like burglaries and car breaks. We have growing NHS waiting lists, and even the anger we saw spill out on the streets of Britain during the summer is in large part a product of a stagnating economy. The average age for somebody buying their first apartment or house in Britain is 34. In London, where all the good jobs are, it's 37, which means that even the small fraction of our young people who can afford to buy their own house will probably do it when it's too late for them to have children for purely biological reasons. And while expensive housing and a stagnating economy are not the only explanation for this, they are a significant contributor to the fact that Britain's total fertility rate has fallen massively in the last 60 years. In 1964, the average British woman had 3 children. Today, we are way below replacement. As with other troubles of this kind, Britain is not alone. From the US to the entire European Union, to Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, we are not even close to having enough children. This is not a uniquely Western phenomenon, but it is particularly bad in the West. Now look, I don't claim to know what the right number of human beings on planet Earth is. And when I spend an hour on doom scrolling on social media, I increasingly think that number is 0. But what I do know is that if you were a zoologist studying an animal species which was failing to reproduce, you would hardly conclude that everything is going swimmingly. Have you ever heard the expression, it's like getting pandas to mate? It's used to say that something is very difficult because zoos and conservationists are struggling to maintain the panda population. Well, the average female panda will have 5 to 6 children over the course of her lifetime. The average Western female human will have 1.5. This phenomenon has cultural, economic, and even spiritual dimensions. But the fact is that a society which is not having enough children to replace its population is not only doomed to decline, it's also doomed to the mass, uncontrolled immigration of the kind that the entire Western world has seen in recent years. And the reason I bring up mass immigration is that a nation can endure and bounce back from periods of stagnation and even decline, provided there's a sense of common purpose and a willingness to be honest about the problems that society faces. In Britain, we have neither. The nation and the common purpose that came with it is rapidly becoming a thing of the past, to be replaced by the much celebrated communities we hear so much about. Instead of seeing ourselves as British first and everything else second, we increasingly see ourselves as Asian, black, white, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, LGBTQI+ first, and little else second. As for honesty, well, we shun, ostracize, and in Britain increasingly set the police on people who express widely held views about illegal immigration, Islamist terrorism, and the failure of multiculturalism. Especially if they come from the working class, whose crass ways and ugly sentiments offend the chattering classes. And yet, despite all of this, I see no urgency. When I listen to the people who run my country, of all political persuasions, they all think that this is normal, a problem to be managed. I assumed this was the case, that they were putting this face on for public consumption, but I'm afraid behind closed doors, they're all exactly the same. And people say that if we were attacked, we'd struggle to get people to enlist. I think that's complete nonsense. I think if we suffered what the people of Ukraine have suffered, or what the people of Israel suffered on October 7th, there would be millions of people in our countries that would rise to defend it, and millions of others to support the war effort. But the problem is, we're not in a war. There is no enemy to fight. And so nobody knows what to do, which is why what we have is just a creeping, unstoppable malaise. Even now, with the wave of enthusiasm that has swept Argentina and the United States, because the problem is not our politicians, it's us. Milei won in Argentina because he promised to cut red tape, taxes, and bureaucrats with his chainsaw of freedom. Trump won in America because he promised to cut regulation, taxes, and waste. Europeans, on the other hand, are very clear. We want higher taxes and more government. This is why no politician in Britain or in Europe talks about unleashing the talents of our people. We don't want to be unleashed. We want to be looked after. We need to recognize that the answer to our problems is to create a vibrant and growing economy, not to hike up tax rates and energy prices to chase industrial, creative, and wealthy people out of our countries. Britain, if you don't know, has lost more millionaires in recent years than any country in the world except China. We need to spend more time focusing on building wealth instead of arguing about how to divide it. We need to aspire to do things, to make things, to create things. I know that many of you don't like him, but if you're even remotely curious or intellectually honest, you have to ask yourself, why has Elon Musk become an icon to hundreds of millions of people around the world? It's not his charismatic speeches and stunning good looks. It's the fact that he builds big things, and in doing so reminds us who we're supposed to be. We're supposed to reach for the stars, not into our neighbors' pockets. I know that to the British ear, and by the judging by your faces, also to the Norwegian ear, this sounds like immense cringe. I understand, I do. This mindset shift we need is going to be very difficult. It's like getting Westerners to mate. But I'm here to tell you something that you already know. Until we decide to become a civilization that wants to succeed, we will not. Thank you very much.
So, where to start with this?